Graduation day was a significant moment for her, a day she had worked hard for. Her heart raced as she put on the gown, adjusting the cap that felt heavier than it looked. Her family was there, cheering her on, but it wasn't just about the diploma. For her, this was a symbol of growth, hard work, and all the sacrifices she had made to get here. She glanced around at her classmates as they gathered in the auditorium. The bright smiles and excitement in the air were contagious. Her friends were talking about their future plans, their families snapping pictures, and there was a buzz of chatter everywhere. But in the midst of all the celebration, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her stepfather, a man who had been there for her since her mother remarried years ago, stood quietly by her side, waiting for the ceremony to begin. He wasn't the kind of man to take up space or draw attention to himself. His presence, however, was felt in the calm way he carried himself, in the way he supported her and her mother, and in his unspoken love. But today, it seemed like that presence was drawing the wrong kind of attention. As she moved to take her seat, she noticed some of the other students giving her stepfather strange sidelong glances. There were a few whispered comments, some stifled laughs, and she could feel the weight of the looks. She wanted to ignore it, to just focus on her big day. But it was hard when she could see her stepfather's discomfort. He wasn't like the other fathers. He didn't wear a suit, didn't have a flashy car, and didn't come from wealth. But he was there for her in every way that mattered. It didn't matter to her that he wasn't her biological father. He had been there when no one else was. But as the ceremony started, she felt the eyes of her classmates linger on him, and she couldn't help but feel embarrassed. It wasn't just that they were judging him. They were mocking him. His presence, his history, everything about him seemed to make them uncomfortable. The whispers grew louder as the principal began his speech. She tried to ignore them, to focus on the words being spoken, but her mind kept drifting. She glanced at her stepfather again. He was trying his best to appear unfazed, but she could see the tightness in his jaw and the way he clenched his fists by his sides. She didn't know what it was about him that made some people feel the need to mock. Maybe it was the color of his skin or the way he dressed. Maybe it was because he didn't try to fit in with the others, didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. But whatever the reason, it hurt her deeply. She wished she could explain to everyone how much he meant to her, how much he had done for her. As the ceremony went on, she could see the glances turning into something more deliberate. Some of the popular kids in her class were whispering to each other, pointing in his direction, their eyes flicking between him and her. It was as though they couldn't understand why she would choose to bring him along, why she would let someone like him take part in such an important moment in her life. The mocking didn't stop. Even when she went up to receive her diploma, she could hear the snickers, the barely contained laughter from the crowd. She tried to shake it off, tried to smile, to pretend like she didn't notice, but it was impossible to ignore the way her stepfather was being treated. When she returned to her seat, she found him standing there, his expression neutral but his eyes betraying his hurt. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that everything was okay, but she didn't know how. It wasn't okay, and she knew that no matter what she said, nothing could change the way he was being treated in that moment. The next few hours felt like a blur. The graduation speeches, the pictures, the congratulatory hugs, none of it mattered to her anymore. All she could think about was how her stepfather had been treated, how he had been reduced to a joke in the eyes of so many people she had grown up with. She felt a deep anger inside her, an anger that was hard to articulate. She wasn't sure if it was anger at her classmates for their ignorance, or at herself for not being able to protect him. As the ceremony ended, and the graduates began to spill out into the parking lot, her stepfather quietly put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything at first, just offered a comforting touch, and it made her heart ache even more. He didn't deserve this, and she didn't know how to make it right. They walked out of the auditorium together, the weight of the day pressing down on both of them. She could feel the stares of her classmates as they passed, but she tried to block them out. Her mind was swirling with a mix of emotions. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and yet all she could think about was how her stepfather was treated on a day that should have been about her accomplishments. It was a moment she would never forget, one that left a mark on her heart, a memory that would shape her view of the world forever. Her stepfather, who had always been there for her, who had loved her as his own, was mocked in front of an entire audience. And it hurt more than she ever could have imagined. But what none of them knew, what no one could have known at that moment, was that this wasn't the end of his story. It wasn't the end of her story either. Because sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones that everyone notices right away. Sometimes the people who matter most are the ones who quietly stand by, even when they're not given the credit they deserve. And her stepfather was about to show them all just who he really was. Her stepfather's story was not one told in school textbooks or on the news. It wasn't a story of immediate success or fame, but it was one of perseverance, hard work, and grit. He was born into a family that had very little. His parents, like so many others, had to fight for everything they had. He remembered his childhood all too well, growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and where getting out felt like an impossible dream. From a young age, he understood that life was not fair. People around him, some friends and even family members, often faced unfair treatment because of the color of their skin. It was a daily reality that shaped him in ways most people couldn't understand. His mother worked tirelessly to provide for their family. She had 2 jobs and still somehow managed to show up with a smile. His father, though present in their lives, wasn't the most reliable. That responsibility fell on his shoulders, watching over his younger siblings, making sure they were fed, and doing whatever he could to help his mother make ends meet. It wasn't easy, and there were many nights when he went to bed hungry, just to make sure his little brother had enough to eat. Despite the struggles, there was always an underlying belief in him, an unspoken faith from his mother that he could be something more. She would often say, "Don't let where you're from decide where you're going." Those words stuck with him throughout his life, pushing him to keep going even when the world seemed to be against him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he would work hard to carve out a better life for himself. School was a place where he could escape, if only for a few hours each day. He wasn't the most popular kid in class, but he was bright, hard-working, and curious. His teachers saw potential in him, and that was enough to fuel his desire to keep moving forward. But even in school, the world outside would make its presence known. He often dealt with racism, bullying, and prejudice. Some students and even some teachers, though not overtly mean, made him feel like he didn't belong. There were whispers, jokes, and sideways glances, but he learned to shrug them off. He knew that education was his ticket to something better, something bigger. As the years passed, he grew more determined. He went to college, something that no one in his family had done before. He worked part-time jobs just to make ends meet and juggled his studies with long hours of work. It was exhausting, but he pushed through. He had one goal: to make something of himself, to prove to the world that where he came from did not define who he could become. Eventually, he graduated with a degree and found work in a field that he was passionate about. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and for him that was enough. He worked hard, proving himself day after day, showing up on time and giving everything he had. Over time, his reputation grew. He became known as someone who could be relied upon, someone who never gave up, no matter the obstacles in his way. But no matter how far he went, no matter how much he accomplished, there was always something that held him back. He never felt like he could fully relax, never felt like he could completely let his guard down. The world still saw him for what he was: a black man, a person of color, someone who didn't quite fit in. He learned to live with it, but it wasn't easy. Every day he had to fight against the stereotypes, the prejudice, the discrimination. He had to prove that he was worthy, even though he knew deep down that his worth was never something that should have been in question. When he met his wife, everything changed. She was kind, strong, and had a heart full of love. Her children, his future stepchildren, were something he never expected, but he embraced them without hesitation. He knew what it meant to feel alone, to feel like you didn't belong, and he would never allow them to feel that way. He wanted to be a father figure for them, someone they could look up to, someone who would always have their back no matter what. He could never have anticipated how challenging it would be to be a stepfather. At first, there were misunderstandings, awkward moments and doubts. He wasn't their biological father, and there were times when he felt like he had to prove himself. But over time, they formed a bond that was stronger than anything he had ever experienced. He became more than just a father figure. He became their protector, their mentor, and their source of stability. He worked hard to make a life for his new family, to give them a future that was brighter than the one he had grown up with. There were struggles, of course. He still had to deal with the occasional glance or comment from people who didn't understand why a man like him would want to marry a woman like his wife. But he didn't let that stop him. He had seen enough of the world to know that people would always judge him, no matter what he did. The key was to not let their judgment define who he was. Years went by and his stepchildren grew older. He was there for every school play, every soccer game, every family event. He watched them graduate from high school, knowing that his support had helped them get there. Through all the trials and triumphs, he was their constant, their rock. He loved them as his own, even when others didn't see it. He gave them everything he had, just as he had promised himself when he first became a father. On the day of his stepdaughter's graduation, he felt an immense sense of pride. He had supported her through thick and thin. He had been there for her when she needed him, and he had watched her become the young woman she was today. But as he stood there in the audience watching her take the stage, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The laughter and whispers from the crowd made him uneasy, but he didn't let it show. He was used to this, to being the subject of ridicule simply because of the way he looked or the color of his skin. What the crowd didn't know was that this day wasn't just about her graduation. It was about him too. The man who had fought through adversity, who had built a life out of nothing, who had loved unconditionally. He wasn't there to seek approval or recognition. He had already earned that in his own way. But today he was about to show everyone what kind of man he truly was, and just how wrong they were to judge him. As the ceremony continued, the excitement in the air seemed to shift. The young woman's heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. She had worked so hard to get to this moment, but all she could think about was the way her stepfather had been treated. The whispers, the stares, everything about it made her want to disappear. But she couldn't. This day was supposed to be about her, and yet it felt like a strange mix of celebration and discomfort. She had always admired her stepfather's ability to remain calm in situations where others might lose their temper or let their emotions take over. It was one of the things that made him such a steady, reliable presence in her life. But today, as she sat in the crowded auditorium watching her classmates chat and laugh, she could see that he was holding something back. His face, as always, was composed, but she could tell that the laughter from the crowd, the judgment in the air, had struck a chord with him. It wasn't just about him feeling uncomfortable. It was about her too. She couldn't understand why anyone would mock him. He had done everything right. He had worked tirelessly to give her the life she had. He had put in long hours at work to make sure that they had a roof over their heads and food on the table. He had been there for every small victory and every hardship, quietly supporting her and guiding her, never once expecting recognition. But today, he was getting something else entirely. Disrespect. She felt a pang of guilt as she thought about it. How had she let it go on for so long without confronting it? Why hadn't she stood up for him sooner? Her mind kept turning over the moments she had spent sitting quietly while the mockery unfolded, wondering how she had been so passive. The feelings inside her swirled: anger, frustration, and a sense of helplessness. She wanted to scream at the top of her lungs to tell everyone exactly who her stepfather was and what he meant to her. She wanted to make them understand that they were looking at the wrong person. As her name was called to walk across the stage, her thoughts briefly shifted away from the chaos around her. She stood up, smoothing the creases of her gown, and felt her heart pound. She walked to the stage slowly, not because she was nervous, but because she felt the weight of the moment, the weight of all the unsaid words, all the things she wanted to tell the crowd. As she took her diploma from the principal, she caught a glimpse of her stepfather sitting in the audience, his expression unreadable. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment everything else faded away. She smiled, a real smile, the kind that came from deep inside, not because of the ceremony, but because of him. She walked back to her seat, but the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed louder now. There was something about her stepfather's presence that continued to draw attention, and not the kind he deserved. She wanted to scream, to call them out, but instead she sat down and tried to focus on what was happening in front of her. The ceremony was winding down and the speeches began. She tried to ignore everything else, but it was impossible. As the principal took the microphone again, she saw him glance in her stepfather's direction. Her stepfather shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was a momentary flicker, but she caught it. The principal was about to speak again, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew something was about to happen, but she didn't know what. Ladies and gentlemen, the principal began. We are honored today to have someone very special with us in the audience. Someone who has been an important part of our community for many years. A person whose contributions have shaped the very fabric of our school. Her stepfather's face tightened. He didn't know what to expect. Neither did she. She could see the discomfort in his eyes. He had never been one to seek out the spotlight. In fact, he preferred to stay out of it. But what came next was something she could never have imagined. Please, everyone, the principal continued, join me in welcoming a true legend of our community, a man who has given selflessly, whose dedication to others has made him a role model for everyone here. His hard work and generosity are unmatched. Let's give a warm round of applause to... The principal paused, looking over at her stepfather with a respectful smile. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he really calling her stepfather to the stage? The man who had been ridiculed and dismissed, the one who had been looked down upon by many of her classmates, was now being introduced as a legend. She could hardly believe it. It was at that moment that her mind flashed back to everything her stepfather had done, all the times he had quietly helped without asking for anything in return. He had always been there, whether it was fixing things around the house, helping her with school projects, or just offering words of wisdom when she needed them most. He had quietly shaped her life, not with grand gestures, but with steady, quiet actions that made all the difference. The applause around her was hesitant at first. Some of her classmates were confused, unsure why he was being called to the stage. But as her stepfather stood up, something shifted. The room grew quieter. His slow, steady walk toward the stage was filled with a kind of quiet dignity, and she could see the respect starting to grow in the eyes of those around her. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but there was a shift. They were beginning to see him for who he really was. As he reached the stage, the principal shook his hand and handed him the microphone. For a moment, her stepfather stood there, looking out at the audience. His eyes scanned the crowd, and she could see his nerves. He wasn't the kind of person to speak in front of a crowd. He didn't seek attention, never had. But now here he was, standing in front of everyone who had once looked down on him, ready to speak. Her heart beat faster as he finally opened his mouth. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "Thank you for this recognition, but I must say that what I've done for this community, for this school, has never been for recognition. It's been for the people. It's been for the kids like the ones sitting in front of me today. Kids who have dreams, who are striving to be better, and who just need someone to believe in them." His voice grew stronger as he continued, and she could see the crowd slowly warming to him. "I didn't do this for myself," he said. "I did this because I believe in what we can all accomplish when we work together, when we support one another. I've seen too many people counted out because of where they come from or the color of their skin. I've seen too many people pushed to the side when all they wanted was a chance to prove themselves. And I'm here today to tell you that no matter where you come from, no matter the obstacles in your way, you have something valuable to offer." Her stepfather paused for a moment, and she could see the sincerity in his eyes. She knew those words came from his heart. The applause grew louder this time, and she could hear the difference in it. It was no longer uncertain or confused. It was genuine, respectful. He had won them over, not with flashy words or grand speeches, but with his truth. He had shown them all that he was more than what they thought. He had shown them the kind of man he truly was. As her stepfather left the stage, the young woman felt a rush of pride. She knew that this moment, this recognition, was long overdue. The mockery, the whispers, the judgment, those would fade. But what would stay was the respect he had earned today, and for the first time that day she felt like everything was right. The world had seen him for who he really was, and there was no turning back. As the days passed following the graduation, everything seemed to settle back into a new normal. The young woman tried to return to her life, to focus on her plans for the future, but something was different. Her stepfather's unexpected recognition had stirred something deep inside her, a mix of pride, relief, and a sense of justice that she hadn't realized was so important to her. The echoes of his speech on graduation day still lingered in her mind. She kept replaying his words, the way he had spoken so openly about his struggles, his determination, and his belief in everyone's potential. It had been a powerful moment, but what mattered most was how it had changed the way the people around her viewed him. Those who had once ridiculed him now looked at him with respect, something she had always known he deserved but never expected the world to acknowledge. In the days that followed, It was clear that people began to see him differently. Teachers, students, even parents from the school, those who had once looked at him with doubt or curiosity, approached him with newfound respect. Her classmates, those who had mocked him just days earlier, now greeted him with warm smiles and apologies. It was almost as if they had all been blind before, unable to see the man who had been quietly contributing to their community, supporting their school, and doing good for so many years. But it wasn't just the crowd at the graduation who had changed their view. She noticed a subtle shift in the way her stepfather carried himself. He was always quiet, always humble, but now there was a confidence in his step, a certain peace that she hadn't seen before. It was as if he no longer needed to prove himself, as if the world had finally recognized his worth. One afternoon, while they were sitting in the living room, the young woman couldn't hold it in any longer. She had been thinking about it for days, the way everything had shifted so dramatically. She turned to her stepfather, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I just want to say thank you," she said, her words filled with emotion. "Thank you for everything, for always being there for me, for doing what you did. I don't think I've ever told you how much I appreciate you, but I want you to know now. What you did, it wasn't just about you. It was about me, about all of us." He looked at her with a gentle smile, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. She could see that he didn't expect gratitude. He never had. His love for her had always been unconditional, without the need for recognition. But there was something different in the air now. Something had shifted in him too. "You don't need to thank me for anything," he replied, his voice steady though his eyes were soft. "I've always done what I thought was right. Being here for you, supporting you. That was never about getting a reward. It's just what I do, what any father should do." But she shook her head, her eyes locked with his. "It wasn't just fatherly duty. It was your heart. You didn't just show up for me. You showed up for me in ways I didn't even realize. Every day when it would have been easy to walk away, you didn't. You stayed. And that means more to me than anything." He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at her as if processing her words. He had always been the kind of person who believed in action over words, but there was a deep understanding between them in that moment. She didn't need to explain further. He knew exactly what she meant, and for the first time it seemed like he was allowing himself to feel the weight of what he had accomplished, not just in his own life, but in hers as well. Over the next few weeks, the respect for him continued to grow. Word had spread about his contribution to the school, and more people began to acknowledge him for the man he was, not just the outsider who had married into their community. He was invited to community events, offered opportunities to speak at local meetings, and even asked to mentor younger generations who looked up to him. It was a far cry from the days when people had mocked him for simply being present at his stepdaughter's graduation. But even with all the newfound attention, he remained the same quiet, humble man. He never sought the spotlight, never once tried to capitalize on the recognition. In fact, he often downplayed it, choosing instead to help others, to give his time and energy to people who needed it. But something in his eyes told a different story. He had earned this recognition, and while he wouldn't ever ask for it, he was learning to accept it. There were still moments, though, when the young woman noticed the weight of the past lingering in her stepfather's actions. Despite all the acknowledgement, despite the applause and respect, there were still traces of the old insecurities that had been planted in him over the years. She could see it in the way he hesitated when people praised him, the slight discomfort in his posture when someone spoke highly of him. He didn't know how to fully accept what had come his way, and she understood why. The truth was, his entire life had been a series of proving himself to others. From his childhood to his career, he had always been seen through a lens of skepticism. People had questioned his abilities, his character, and his worth. But now, for the first time, he was being acknowledged for the man he truly was. One afternoon, as they were having lunch together, she asked him something that had been on her mind for weeks. "How do you feel about all of this?" she asked, her tone curious but gentle. "The recognition, the change in how people treat you. Does it feel different?" He took a slow sip of his drink before answering, his eyes thoughtful. "It does feel different, but it's not about the recognition. It's about the fact that people are finally seeing what I've been trying to show them all along, who I really am. And not just me, but others too. People don't always see the worth in someone until they have to, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's how the world works. But I know now that I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I've done my part. I've been there for you, for your mom, and for this community. That's enough." His words were simple, but they held so much weight. She realized that, in a way, he had never needed the world to acknowledge his worth. He had always known it deep down. It had just taken the world a little longer to see what she had always known. As the days went by, her respect for him grew even deeper. She saw the quiet strength in him more than ever, the way he handled everything from the mockery to the applause with the same steady grace. He was a man who had never sought attention, who had always done the right thing without expecting anything in return. And now, finally, he was beginning to see the value of his own work, his own sacrifices, and his own love. For the first time, he was allowing himself to feel proud of the life he had built, not just for himself, but for the people he cared about most. The days following his moment on stage at the graduation ceremony were filled with a strange mix of emotions for the young woman. She had never seen her stepfather like this before. He had always been the quiet, reliable figure in her life, the man who quietly made a difference without needing any recognition for it. But now the world was beginning to see him for who he really was, and she was proud, more proud than she had ever been. Despite the positive changes, there was still an undercurrent of unease. Her stepfather had always been someone who preferred to stay in the background, out of the spotlight. He wasn't the kind of man to seek out attention, even though he had earned every bit of recognition he was now receiving. She knew he was still adjusting to the idea of being acknowledged, and in his quiet way he seemed to wrestle with the attention. But what was most surprising to her was the shift in her own perspective. She had always seen him as the steady presence in her life, the one who had given her everything. But after the recognition, she saw him in a different light, not just as the man who had always been there for her, but as someone who had fought against the odds his entire life. Someone who had worked hard against all expectations to make a life for himself and for those he loved. It wasn't just that he had earned the recognition, it was the fact that he had lived his life in a way that most people would never understand. He had endured so much in silence, so many battles fought in the quiet corners of his life. And now he was being seen for the first time in a way that truly reflected who he was, what he had accomplished, and the love he had given to everyone around him. As the weeks went by, her stepfather continued to maintain his usual quiet demeanor, but the respect he had earned from the community became a part of his daily life. He wasn't suddenly a different person. He hadn't changed at his core. But now when people spoke to him, when they acknowledged his contributions, she could see that something inside him was shifting. He was beginning to allow himself to accept the recognition without feeling like it was a burden. For so long, he had been the one to give, never asking for anything in return. But now people were giving back to him, and it was something he was slowly learning to embrace. One evening, as the young woman and her stepfather sat together in the living room, she could see that he was deep in thought, his brow furrowed as he stared out the window, lost in some faraway thought. She had learned over the years not to push him when he was in these moods, but tonight something felt different. She could sense that he was wrestling with something. "Gee, more than usual. Is everything okay?" she asked softly, her voice full of concern. He didn't turn to her right away, but she could see the sigh escape his lips as he finally looked over at her. "Yeah, just thinking," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been getting all this recognition lately, and I can't help but wonder if I'm worthy of it. I've always done what I felt was right, but now that people are noticing, it's strange. I never wanted any of this. I never did what I did for anyone's praise. But now that it's here, it feels a little overwhelming." She sat up straighter, looking at him carefully. This was the side of him she didn't often see, the uncertainty, the vulnerability. It was hard to imagine her strong, steady stepfather feeling anything less than confident in himself. But she knew this was part of the process of accepting the recognition that had so long eluded him. "You're more than worthy of it," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Everything you've done, every sacrifice, every small act of kindness, it's all part of who you are. You don't need to question whether you deserve it. You've earned every bit of it. Maybe you didn't need the applause before, but you do now. You deserve it. You've always been there for me, for Mom, for everyone around you." He looked at her for a moment, his eyes softening as he listened to her words. There was a long silence between them before he finally spoke again. "It's just that I've always believed in doing the right thing, regardless of whether anyone notices. And now that people are noticing, it feels like, I don't know, like I'm being seen for something I didn't expect. I guess I just never thought I'd be here. She nodded, understanding him better than she could express. She knew that for him, the idea of recognition was a foreign concept. For so long he had done things quietly without any expectation of thanks. Now that the world was acknowledging him, it was almost as if it had come too late and it was something he was struggling to accept. "You've done it all for us," she said softly. "You've built this life for us, for me, for Mom. You've made sure we always had what we needed even when it was hard. And now you're being recognized for the man you are. It's okay to accept that. It's okay to be proud of what you've done." He seemed to consider her words carefully, the weight of the conversation settling over them both. Then after a long pause, he nodded slowly. "I guess I never really thought of it like that. I've just always been focused on doing what's right, you know? But maybe it's time to start accepting what's coming my way." She smiled, feeling a sense of pride welling up in her chest. It wasn't just about the recognition, though that was important. It was about him finally accepting the worth he had always carried, even when no one else saw it. In the days that followed, the young woman noticed a subtle change in her stepfather. He still wasn't the type to seek out attention, but when people spoke to him now, when they acknowledged his contributions, he seemed to stand a little taller. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself that hadn't been there before. It wasn't arrogance, but something deeper, an understanding of his own worth, his own place in the world. The respect he had earned wasn't just from others, it was from himself too. For the first time, he was allowing himself to feel proud of who he had become and what he had achieved. And that made all the difference. One day, a few weeks after the graduation, the young woman came home from work to find her stepfather sitting at the kitchen table, a letter in front of him. It was from the community center, an invitation for him to speak at an upcoming event. She could see the look on his face, surprised, unsure, but also a little excited. "Look at this," he said, holding the letter up for her to see. "They want me to speak. They want me to share my story." Her heart swelled with pride as she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't just about being asked to speak. It was about the fact that someone had recognized him for who he was, for all the quiet ways he had helped others. He wasn't just a background figure anymore. He was someone people wanted to hear from. "You should do it," she said, her voice steady with encouragement. "You've earned it. People need to hear your story." He looked at her, then back at the letter, and for the first time she saw the acceptance in his eyes. It wasn't just about doing the right thing anymore. It was about embracing the fact that his story mattered. "I think I will," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I think it's time I shared it." And in that moment she knew that the journey they had both been on was far from over. But whatever came next, she was proud of the man her stepfather had become. The man who had been silently shaping the world around him, and who, finally, was being seen for the legend he truly was. The day of the event had arrived. The community center was buzzing with activity as people filed in, eager to hear from the guest speaker. The young woman stood at the back of the room, watching her stepfather as he stood near the front, his hands folded in front of him, a quiet determination in his eyes. This was a big moment, one that just a few months ago he never would have imagined. But today he was about to share his story with a room full of people, something he had never done before. She could see the uncertainty still lingering in his eyes, despite all the recognition he had received. He had always been someone who preferred to keep his thoughts and experiences to himself, quietly moving through life without drawing attention. But today, he was going to do something different. He was going to speak up and let people hear what he had to say. The young woman felt a mix of pride and nervousness as she watched him take the stage. He wasn't the kind of person who thrived in the spotlight, and she knew that this was a huge step for him. But she also knew that this was exactly what he deserved, a chance to be heard, to be recognized not just for what he had done, but for who he was. As he stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. For a brief moment, it seemed like the weight of the moment had settled over him just as it had for her. She could see his hands tremble slightly, his breath coming in slow, steady pulls as he looked out over the crowd. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "Thank you all for being here today. I'll be honest, I didn't think I'd ever be standing up here talking to a group of people about my life. It's not something I ever thought I'd do. The room was still, the audience hanging on every word. The young woman watched him, her heart swelling with pride. She had known, even before this moment, that he had something worth sharing. He had always been a man of action, never seeking attention, but his story was one that could inspire, one that could help others see that their own struggles were not the end of their story. I never thought I had much to say, he continued, his voice gaining strength. I grew up in a place where it felt like the odds were stacked against me. I had to fight for everything I had, work harder than most people I knew just to get by. And through it all, I never felt like I belonged in the world I was trying to make a place for myself in. The room seemed to lean in, as though everyone could relate to his words. The young woman could feel the weight of his story, the years of struggle and sacrifice that had led him to this point. He had never been one to speak about his past. He had always kept it hidden, tucked away in the corners of his life. But now he was sharing it with the world, and it was as though the audience was seeing him for the first time. For most of my life, I lived in a world where people looked at me and saw only what they expected to see. They saw a man who didn't belong, a man who was different from the rest. And for a long time I let that define me. I let the world tell me who I was, what I could be. He paused for a moment, his eyes sweeping the crowd. The young woman could see that he was searching for the right words, but she knew it didn't matter what he said next.
He had already said enough.
His honesty, his vulnerability, those were the things that people needed to hear. But something changed along the way, he continued. I realized that it wasn't the world that had the power to define me. It was me. It was up to me to decide who I was and what I could accomplish. And the first thing I had to do was stop letting other people's expectations hold me back. The young woman felt a smile tug at the corners of her lips as she listened to him speak. He had never been someone who shared his feelings easily. But now he was letting it all out. He was telling the world that he wasn't just the man they thought he was. He was more than that. He was someone who had fought, who had struggled, and who had overcome the odds not for recognition, but because that's what he had always done. I've spent a lot of years fighting battles that no one knew about, he said, his voice steady. But I've also spent a lot of years learning that no matter where you come from, no matter who you are, you have something valuable to offer this world. And I'm here today, standing in front of all of you to tell you that you're not defined by your past. You're not defined by what other people think of you. You are defined by what you choose to do with the life you've been given. There was a long pause as the audience sat in silence, taking in his words. The young woman's heart swelled with emotion as she watched him, seeing him in a way she never had before. This was the man who had raised her, who had been her rock, the one who had always shown up for her, even when the world seemed to be telling him to stay down. And now he was giving everyone the chance to see the depth of who he really was. I'm not here because I want recognition, he said quietly, and I'm not here to say that I've got everything figured out. I've made mistakes. I've had my share of failures. But I'm here to tell you that if I can do it, so can you. You have everything you need inside of you to overcome whatever comes your way. As he spoke those words, the young woman felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had always known the kind of man her stepfather was, but seeing him speak with such power, with such clarity, made her realize just how much he had to offer the world. He wasn't just a man who had been there for her. He was a man who had the wisdom, the strength, and the heart to inspire others. And now finally the world was starting to see it. When he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. The young woman couldn't help but smile through the tears that had started to form in her eyes. This was the moment she had always known was coming. The moment when her stepfather, the man who had always been in the background, would finally be recognized for the greatness that had always been within him. And she couldn't be prouder. After the event, people crowded around him, offering congratulations and kind words. But it wasn't the praise that mattered to her stepfather. It was the fact that he had shared his truth and in doing so, had given others the courage to do the same. He wasn't just a man who had risen above the challenges of his past. He was a man who had found his voice and by doing so had helped others find theirs. The young woman joined him at the end of the evening, her heart full. She had always known that her stepfather was someone special, but tonight the world had seen it too, and she knew that this was just the beginning. His story, his strength, and his wisdom would continue to inspire those around him for years to come. As they walked home together, she looked up at him, a smile on her face. "You did it," she said quietly. "You shared your story. He glanced down at her, a small, proud smile on his face. I guess I did. And as they walked side by side, she knew that whatever came next, her stepfather would face it with the same quiet strength, the same resilience, and the same love that had always guided him. This was his time, and she was grateful to be a part of it.